A typical cell of any organism contains genetic information that specifies its traits. Did you know that there are over 150 dog breeds, but they are all the same species, Canis familiaris? A pug looks completely different than a black lab, yet they both came from the same ancestors. For thousands of years, dog breeders have selected certain traits to produce dog breeds for different purposes. A trait is a characteristic that an organism can pass on to its offspring. Ancient dog breeders thought that the traits inherited by a dog were a blend of those from the mother and the father. A large dog crossed with a small dog, for example, often would produce a medium-sized dog, a blend of both parents. It turns out that heredity is not that simple. An Austrian monk, Gregor Mendel, in 1822, was one of the first to find that out. Mendel is often called the father of genetics. Genetics is the study of heredity. An organism's heredity is the set of traits it receives from its parent. Through many years of experiments in breeding pea plants, Mendel arrived at some important conclusions about inheritance. Mendel worked in a garden at the monastery where he lived. Through his work, he became interested in the traits of plants and how those traits were passed on to offspring. For example, he noticed that a trait that appeared in the parent generation of the plants did not show up in their offspring, the first generation. But in the second generation, the trait showed up again. Mendel wanted to find out why, so he decided to study the inheritance of peas. Peas were a good choice because they grow quickly and they are easy to breed. Peas are flowering plants that have male and female parts on the same plant. Flowering plants reproduce by pollination. During pollination, pollen containing sperm from the male part of the plant, the anther, is carried to the female part of the egg, the ovule. In a pea plant, pollen can fertilize eggs on the same plant, self-pollination, or the pollen can be carried by the wind or an animal to another plant. Mendel studied pea plants and identified several traits that had only two forms. For example, he observed that pea plants produced plants with either purple flowers or white flowers. For his experiments, Mendel was careful to start out with true breeding plants. When a true breeding plant self-pollinates, it will always produce offspring with the same form of the trait as the parent plant. For example, a true breeding plant with the purple flowers will only produce plants with purple flowers. Mendel wanted to find out what would happen if he crossed two plants with different forms of a trait. He used a method called cross-pollination. In cross-pollination, the parts that contain pollen, anthers, are removed from one plant so it cannot self-pollinate. Next, the pollen from the other plant is used to fertilize the plant without pollen. When Mendel crossed true breeding purple-flowered plants with true breeding white-flowered plants, the first generation produced all purple-flowered plants. Mendel got similar results for the other traits he studied. Next, Mendel allowed the first generation of plants to self-pollinate. When the purple-flowered plants of the first generation self-pollinated, white flowers showed up again in the second generation. First generation, all purple flowers. Then they self-pollinate. Second generation, 3 purple flowers for every 1 white flower. The parent generation had cross-pollination. The first generation had all purple flowers. Then there was self-pollination, and in the second generation, 3 purples to 1 white were recorded. Mendel compared the number of purple to white flowers by counting them. A ratio is a way to compare two numbers. Here's how Mendel calculated the ratio of purple flowers to white flowers. Mendel got similar results for the second generation of all the traits he studied. From his results, Mendel proved that all traits do not blend in a 50-50 ratio. Pea plants preferred one trait over another in a ratio of about 3 to 1. Mendel concluded that pea traits like flower color were determined by separate units. From the results, Mendel proved that all traits do not blend. For instance, purple flowers mixed with white flowers did not produce pink flowers. Mendel concluded that traits like flower color must be determined by individual units. Today we call these units gene. A gene is a unit that determines traits. Mendel concluded that for each trait he studied, a pea plant must contain two forms of the same gene. Different forms of the same gene are called alleles. The dominant allele is the form of the gene that when present covers up the appearance of the recessive allele. The recessive allele is the form of a gene that is hidden when the dominant allele is present. The gene for flower color in peas has a dominant allele that causes purple flowers and the recessive allele that causes white flowers. Alleles are different forms of the same gene. Organisms have at least two alleles for each gene, one from each parent. An organism's phenotype is the form of a trait that it displays. For flower color, a pea plant can display phenotype of purple or white flowers. An organism's genotype is the alleles of a gene it contains. Based on his data, Mendel concluded that a phenotype can be determined by more than one genotype. Mendel used upper and lowercase letters to symbolize the alleles of his gene. For flower color, he used the uppercase P for purple, the dominant allele, and the lowercase little p for white, the recessive allele. A pea plant with purple flowers could have a genotype of either capital P or capital P little p. A pea plant with white flowers could only have a phenotype of little p. As long as at least one dominant allele is present, the plant will always have a phenotype of purple flower.